So welcome once again, everyone, to this panel session on how we can foster an inclusive digital development. My name is Miriam Niehaus, and I'm the head of programs at the International Civil Society Center. For the benefit of visually impaired people, I am a white woman wearing a black blazer. It is now my pleasure to welcome today's panel on this topic. We are really pleased to have such a full and qualified group of people with us who've also been working with us within the Leave No One Behind partnership. And I would now like to hand over to the chair of this panel, Claudia Wells, who is the Director of Data Use at Development Initiatives and who's been really a very much valued member of the Leave No One Behind partnership. The floor is yours, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Mariam, and thank you so much for inviting me to chair this really vital and very interesting session on how we can foster more inclusive digital development. I'm Claudia Wells. I'm the Director of Data Use at Development Initiatives. For those who are visually impaired, I'm a white woman with blonde hair sitting in South Wales, where it's rather grey at the moment. I hope you're in better locations. As Mariam said, Development Initiatives have been really proud partners of the Leave No One Behind partnership for a few years now, where we've been supporting the range of country coalitions on their data and evidence production. And in particular, Development Initiatives is an organisation that supports a range of partners working with data across that data value chain, from collection to production, all the way through to analysis and communication. And I'm really delighted to be joining this panel today. This is a fast evolving digital world. International development actors are increasingly using data and digital technologies to fulfill their agendas. And I'm sure all of you here have been touched by digitization or digital transformation in some form or another. And although technical advances have brought numerous gains to the development community, it's also widened existing inequalities. Marginalised communities have been left further behind due to the lack of access and opportunities to reap those digital benefits. And in addition, there's an ongoing lack of granular data and insight on the concrete situation for those communities. They're often quite simply invisible in our data sets, and that impedes the development of targeted approaches for their increased inclusion. So as civil society, we have to ask ourselves today, what digital approaches can we apply to foster the inclusion of groups experiencing marginalisation? Are we ready to work more digitally? And are we going to be data-driven? So I've got an excellent range of panelists for you today from a range of our Leave No One Behind partnerships from Kenya and from Malawi, but also some experts in this area from the Apt Institute and the Super Lab. I'm not going to give them full introductions yet, because I will introduce them as they come in for their first interventions, where they can tell you a little bit about themselves. But perhaps I can go straight into a little bit of how development initiatives have been approaching this attempt to transform data systems more digitally, but in an inclusive manner. And if I could ask my colleagues at the centre to perhaps just put up my first slides, and I'll talk a little bit about the work that Development Initiatives we've been supporting across the data community on data values. And I think this is a really valuable approach that we can look at and can foster across that data value chain to ensure things are much more inclusive. And I would love to hear all of your thoughts on this today. So as I said, the Development Initiative supports our partners to use data and evidence and really ensure that that data and evidence is put at the heart of decision making. And we take a really broad look at that data ecosystem. We look at official data sources, but here within the Leave No One Behind partnership, we've been looking at kind of civil society and community driven data and how we can use that alongside all of the range of other data sources that are out there to really provide a rich picture of the lived experience and understand who might be missing from some of our key data sets. But while DI is a data organisation, our passion for data is driven by our commitment to make people's lives better, and the power of data and the power that data has to facilitate this. We only work on projects that can bring about positive change in the lives of people around the world who are living in the most extreme poverty or at the greatest risk of being left behind, or have the least resilience to some of the crises and impacts that we're seeing out there in the external world. We're committed to putting data to use for the good of the people, and the change it brings must be rooted in responding to their needs. And so that's why today I wanted to just quickly talk to you about one of the important projects that we've been working with, which was led by the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and its data values. So if you could just shift to the next slide, I'm going to keep this really, really short. So data values is a global movement sparking dialogue and catalyzing action to ensure that a fair data future is available for all. We've consulted with over 350 people and organizations across 63 different countries, and the project created a shared vision and a manifesto for change on data values. The power to use information to solve society's problems has always been key to human progress. From the printing press to vaccine development, new data analysis and knowledge has empowered people to rewrite the rules and dramatically improve lives. Yet now, as humanity confronts existential challenges like climate change, food insecurity, the increased risk of pandemics, we're not using the best available data to tackle the worst problems. We've got declining trust, exclusion, inequality, and outdated ways of working, and that's creating barriers between data and those who stand to benefit the most from it. Data needs to serve everyone, and getting it right is as much a political and social endeavour as it is a technical one. We must build data systems that help empower people instead of harming and excluding them. And there are so many examples of data creating harm as well as data creating benefit out there that we really need to be cognizant of both sides of that story. This demands a change in the way that we design, collect, fund, manage, and use data. And at DI, we were really proud to co-lead a track on the Data Values project that was centered around data as a route to inclusion and equity. And we worked alongside a really diverse set of people and organizations, and the track became a key theme in the white paper that we published around agency in data. You can find out more about that on the Global Partnership for Sustainable Data's website or on my website. And we've got some links at the end of this presentation if you want to investigate that later. But the work resulted in this data manifesto that you can see on the screen now. It was launched this year, and it's really a call to action to support people to shape how they're represented in data. And to do that, people must have a say in the data design and the collection that affects their lives. Everyone deserves to have their needs and priorities and experience as they define them captured in data. So there's a really important point here about not being prescriptive. Our second call to action is investing in public participation for accountability. People must be included in the decisions related to data use and reuse. This is essential to hold leaders to account, prevent harm, and improve lives. The third is to democratize data skills for greater equality. Everyone everywhere must gain the confidence to engage with and use data. Widespread confidence in data is a building block for a fair data future and access to that digital world out there. Understanding how this is working and how digital transformation works and what the new rules are absolutely vital. Action area 4 is around creating cultures of transparency, data sharing and use. All leaders must invest in strengthening cultures of data use and reuse. Updating positive experiences of regulating, sharing and using data for public good really does build trust, and we've seen that in the evidence that we've found. And finally, we've got to fund open and responsive systems so that all people share in the benefits of data. And that's governments and those that investors and donors must dedicate more funding to data systems. to support action and promote participation and ensure inclusion from start to finish. This means investing in things like national ownership, community engagement in data, and allowing those investments to happen over a greater length of time to ensure that those processes can be truly inclusive. So that's it from me. That's all I'm going to say about the data values, and I'm sure we can bring that into the lively panel discussion later. And I'm looking forward to reflecting on some of these principles and calls for action in some of the work that the panelists here are doing. I've got some links at the end of these slides if you want to know more. But I now want to hand it over to some of my fantastic colleagues on the panel. And the first person is Farnay Narayan. Apologies, I've got my tongue twisted there. Farnay is a senior research associate at APT. He's interested in how data governance frameworks can be leveraged to enable greater social good in a rights and respecting manner. His work has included research on the feasibility of data trusts, analysing the ecosystem of data stewardship, and also keeping tabs on policy developments in the Indian data regulation landscape. Over to you. It was lovely to have you on the panel. Welcome, and we look forward to your intervention.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Hi, everyone. I'm Vinay Narayan. For the benefit of visually impaired participants, I am a brown Indian man, and I'm wearing a black shirt. As Claudia mentioned, I am a senior research associate at APTI Institute. We are a public research institute based in Bangalore in India, and we work at the intersection of technology and society. Before I go into my intervention, I'd also just like to thank Chandani and the entire International Civil Society Center for both having me here as well as having organized this wonderful session. A bit of a background about me. I am a lawyer by training, and I worked at a corporate law firm before making the transition into tech policy, having been a bit disillusioned working with a lot of new tech firms and startups and looking at how they were able to really make use of the lack of any substantial regulation on the digital economy to the benefit and to the detriment of citizens. At APTI, we have two major verticals, the Data Economy Lab and the Digital Public Lab. Most of my work is situated at the Data Economy Lab, and a lot of that work relates to data stewardship. We view data stewardship as sort of a paradigm for participatory and responsible data governance, one that can sort of help address some of the inequalities of the current data/digital economy. As a very, very high level definition of data stewards, we see stewards as sort of trusted independent intermediaries who sit between users like ourselves, data collectors, and the data requesters. Stewards have a range of functions, which I'm not going to go into too much detail about, but I think at the very basic level, they help users negotiate on matters related to their data, such as who's collecting what data about them, who that data is shared with, and what uses that data is put to. The idea is that these stewards, by doing all of this, will help users gain more agency and control over their data, something that Claudia also alluded to in her intervention. One of the core features of stewardship is, of course, participation. And this is something that sort of flows out of the notion that data is not just individual property, but it's more of a common pooled resource, something that belongs to communities as a whole. And the idea here is that, so rather drawing from Elinor Ostrom's groundbreaking work on the governance of commons, we look at stewardship as a mechanism to encourage or rather foster more participatory data governance and involve communities in a much better way in the governance of their data. There is, of course, no one size fits all approach to stewardship. I think it's something that needs to be tailored to the specific social, economic, and political context in which your data stewards are being set up. The idea behind stewardship and the various models that we've seen over the last few years in our work is that based on the level of digital literacy and capacity of the members, the stewards have differing roles and responsibilities. But the idea at the end of the day is to ensure that individual users and communities as a whole have a big say in the use and governance of their data. Over the last 2 years or so, we've been speaking to various actors within the stewardship ecosystem, as well as engaging with other stakeholders in the broader digital space. On the back of this, we released a draft of a playbook that's designed to provide strategies for all of these stakeholders to foster participatory governance through data stewardship. I am aware that while stewardship has gained significant traction over the last few years, particularly models like data trusts and data cooperatives, it is still something that's a bit of an emerging field. What's also really important for us to understand is that how this plays out, as I mentioned, varies as per context. And this distinction is especially important when you look at the global north and the global south. And I think that's also a sort of paradigm that we need to keep in mind when we answer a broad enough question, such as how do we ensure that digital development is more inclusive? And the reason I say this, and it's something that the manifesto that Claudia shared alludes to as well, is that awareness and access about the digital realm varies wildly between the global north and the global south. I think in the global north, there is a lot more awareness about the very concept of digital and data rights. And in the global south, there is either not an awareness or not a capacity to engage with it strongly because there are a lot more pressing issues for people. Having said this, I'd like to quickly look at who we look at as stewards. And while we have defined them as independent intermediaries, stewards can really be anybody. They can be civil society organizations. They could also possibly be governmental institutions or other statutory bodies. But what's important to understand is that it's not the nature of the organization itself, but the principles that they adhere to. And this is where we feel that the principles of stewardship have a very broad application. I think we're already seeing it being recognized slowly in legal systems around the world. I think the EU Data Governance Act recognizes, albeit in a very, very limited term, data cooperatives. And so our hope with our work and our research is that by identifying and speaking to stewards who are already working around the globe, we will be able to distill principles of what works in what context, as well as the challenges they face. And the playbook that we've put out is we see as a first step in sort of pushing the boundary and helping all related stakeholders in this space help communities foster really a more inclusive and participatory process of data collection, processing, storage, and eventually data sharing as well. I see that I'm at about 7 minutes and I'll end my intervention there. Back to you, Claudia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vinay. Such fascinating work, and I'm really looking forward to exploring this concept of the data stewardship a little bit more, especially the role and who should be playing that role. And I think we have an ever-evolving role potentially for our national statistics offices there, but they must be looking at that really broad view of the data ecosystem and ensure that they're not just looking to kind of private sector partnerships, but also civil society sector partnerships as well. So some food for thought for our discussion later, but yeah, fascinating work. Thank you so much. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to our next speaker, and that is Quincy Stumpner from Superlab. Quincy is a policy and foresight lead at Superlab. He's got a background in philosophy, politics and economics with a focus on digital technologies and data ethics. At Superlab, he focuses on the intersectional and decolonial technology foresight and connects Super's research to actors from policy and politics. A fascinating area. I can't wait to hear from you. Quincy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy being here. Thank you to the Leave No One Behind Partnership and the Civil Society Center for having me. I'm a person of color with brown curls calling in from Germany today, and I'm wearing black framed glasses and a yellow jacket. Today, I want to introduce you to the concept of a feminist tech policy, which we have been developing over the past year at Superlab, the organization I'm working for. Before I start, let me say a few sentences about Super. Super is a non-profit based in Berlin. Our work centers on developing more equitable futures in the context of digital technologies. To do so, we do research, we conduct projects using foresight methods, and advocate for an intersectional feminist perspective on digital policy and technology. Why do we think this is important? Well, what we see at the moment, and as many of you know probably as well, is that technology and its policy often are centered around a narrative of innovation, efficiency, and economic growth. We believe that one of the reasons current technologies have so many negative impacts is that tech regulation mostly focuses on the individual. Like that, we often lack an understanding of how it impacts marginalized groups and increases existing power imbalances. And so how can feminist tech policy address these issues? With the feminist tech policy, we want to broaden the focus of technology impacts to include a more societal perspective rather than just an individualistic one. To develop it, we used intersectional feminist theory as a base. And feminist tech policy serves as a sort of meta perspective, I'd say, on technology issues, analyzing them and critically questioning whether the use of technologies is necessary and purposeful. Hence, using an intersectional perspective in this field when looking at technology means to understand tech policy as social policy and not, for example, as economic policy or something else, to center groups pushed to the margins of society within the debate of around technological impacts, to question existing power structures, and to enable an open discourse on just and digital futures. And to make this a bit more tangible, because it is a meta concept, I want to quickly talk about a fictional example of an international civil society organization. And in this example, this organization is currently helping to set up a digital service or digital services with a local partner. And using a feminist tech perspective in this context would mean to start an ongoing reflection process about the tech used in the project, answering questions like, does the deployment of technology X increase inequality of access for a certain group in society? Or who gains a stronger voice by using technology X? And whose voices might be curtailed by implementing this digital service? Moreover, a feminist tech approach would require the CSO to conduct an impact assessment concerning, for example, the use of data in the project. And if standard technology is being used, a likely outcome of such an assessment would question the use of traditional proprietary software like Microsoft's cloud services or Google Docs. Not only would such a service strengthen market power in markets where local digital solutions compete with international corporations, such a use would also most likely reinforce a certain type of colonial extraction structure revolving around data, data directly flowing out of the country and being privately siloed, unable to be used for the benefits of the public within that country. After such an assessment, it would probably make sense for this organization to focus their project on locally rooted open source software and infrastructure in order to evade the mentioned pitfalls of a seemingly quick and efficient tech solution. Yeah, and actually, because I don't want to take up too much time, and we'll have a discussion later on as well, to close this short intro, I want to share a bit of how we're trying to break down this feminist tech policy framework into actionable aspects. And on the one hand, we developed the so-called feminist tech principles over the past year, which are our first effort to create a more practical guide for reflection. They include 12 principles that introduce some of the main ideas of a feminist tech policy and can serve as a guideline for how to approach digital technologies and their use in society and organizations. Since another important part of feminist tech policy is to democratize the discourse around digital futures, we are moreover in the process of developing a foresight toolbox as an effort to expand the use of foresight in civil society organizations and strengthen futures thinking. Because ultimately, it is our aim to initiate a paradigm shift in the way we view, develop, and use digital technologies, away from a perspective of innovation and efficiency towards a more sustainable, human-centered approach to digitization. And for that, we need to develop alternative visions of digital futures and make clear that there is not the one way to create our common digital future. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion later, and back to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Quincy. So much fascinating work that you're doing there. And I've got so many questions on your 12 principles. But in particular, what I think will really resonate, I hope, with the audience today is your intersectional approach, which is absolutely right at the heart of what we're trying to do as part of the Leave No One Behind partnership. So I think that will link really well to my next speaker, Monica Rama. I hope you're there. It's a pleasure to introduce you. You're from VSO International in Kenya, and you're actually one of our partners in the Leave No One Behind partnership as part of the Kenya Coalition. So it's going to be a pleasure to hear from you today. Monica's got over 8 years working experience in development and the humanitarian sector, designing, planning, implementing, monitoring, evaluating high impact projects and programs in a range of different areas, including education, livelihood, health, social accountability, social and disability inclusion. And she's currently a project officer at the voluntary service overseas in Kenya. Monica, over to you to hear a little bit more about the fantastic work that you're leading there. I can't wait to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, and the speakers who've come before me. That was a very elaborate introduction. So a bit of personal description for the sake of those who are visually impaired. I am a Black woman joining from Kenya. I'm wearing a gray polo shirt, currently have short ragged hair, wearing black frames with a hint of purple on the side. So what I'll talk about is about the citizen generated data dashboard that something else that I do. I also lead the coordination of the Leave No One Behind Kenya Coalition project, and in the project aims to improve capacities of marginalized groups and grassroots CSOs for meaningful engagement in an evidence-driven SDGs monitoring, review, and implementation of VNR reporting. Then another thing the project aims at is promoting community-driven data generation on drivers and levels of marginalization in development processes. And the third one is advocating for improvement of regulatory environment to reform practices, systems, and policies to respond to the needs of marginalized groups. So the project has been in existence for about 5 years now, mainly targeting persons with disabilities, youth, and women. And the project has since carried out 2 pieces of research. One has been on the barriers and opportunities for inclusion of persons with disabilities in SDGs processes and development initiatives, including national and county planning and budgeting processes. Another one has been on drivers and levels of marginalization among persons with disabilities in development processes. So you realize these are big pieces of work. We've tried to disseminate the findings as much as possible. Something we also do is build the capacity of these target groups in the areas where there is need and on the gaps identified during needs assessment and those coming out from such researches. So like most CSOs, the member organizations also just generate a lot of individual member organization, community or citizen generated data. And those who are here could also just say that once you get your research findings, your report, and you disseminated the much you can according to the resources you have, the next thing, if it's not published or out in the open, they are sitting somewhere in your shelves or a shared point within the organization. So what LNOB Kenya plans to do is to develop a data community-driven or citizen-driven generated data dashboard to track, analyze, and display this data. So this is being supported by International Institute of Sustainable Development, and of course the linkage was facilitated by International Civil Society Center. A good ground to get baseline information, asks or policy briefs and pieces and agendas you want to push. So the data dashboard will have graphics, charts, tables, information, very visualized data on status of things, the progress and gaps for dissemination. So we will arrange the dashboard in the form of the SDGs the coalition is targeting. So for the SDGs, what are the indicators, the citizen generated data that speak to those indicators? Then we put up the data because we hold a lot of data. So we also intend to use data from Kenya National Bureau of Statistics alongside the project data to provide context for the work the coalition carries out for persons with disabilities. And it is a good thing that the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics officially launched what is a framework to accept, framework to follow, to generate, analyze, and have the citizen generated data accepted for official purposes. So I think in that aspect, we are a bit ahead compared to many other countries. So we'll work together with the Bureau to ensure that the data can be consumed and officially accepted in the whole country before we put them in the dashboard. So this whole process will enable us, the CSO coalition members, members of the public, communities, policymakers, to be able to easily track and visualize progress on issues that matter to them. So the dashboard is customizable. So we can input data that serves us and for the purposes of ideas we are pushing and advocacy initiatives we are trying to achieve. So it will also help to quickly gauge progress and trends over time as concerns to the inclusion of marginalized persons in development processes. It will help us better advocate for evidence-based policy tracking, formulation and amendments, and also transparently to report on results of policy interventions. So you have the data, it is visualized in a dashboard. It is accessible to people. We can upload updated data. So instead of always asking for people, give me the report, what is your data source? So it's easier to have a central place with that data. I know this has been done in other countries, such as other countries such as Bangladesh, Nepal, and India. So we are also aiming to catch up and really do more based on this dashboard. Thank you, Claudia, back to you.
Thank you so much, Monica. It's so fascinating to hear from you, and the amazing progress that you've made in forging that partnership between your citizen-generated data and the groups collecting that, and the official statistics side. And I'd really interested in exploring more. And we've got some questions coming in on this on the chat already, how technology can help ensure persons with disabilities in particular aren't left behind. So I'll just throw that out as an initial question for the rest of the panelists to start thinking about. I know that we've touched on sort of the feminist sort of data theory, and is there anything there that is applicable to contexts where you're working with persons with disabilities who are so often missing from data and are unable to access certain things? So without further ado, I'm going to move on to our final panelist, if that's okay with everyone. So I would like to introduce Chris Chinkota, who is from the Leave No One Behind partnership in Malawi, and in particular he represents Care Malawi. Chris works as the research and development coordinator at Care Malawi. He's responsible for social accountability, learning and development, soliciting ground evidence for national and global advocacy. He's an accomplished rural development and business development professional with over 14 years experience working in and development organizations, and focuses on rural development, providing leadership in policy and strategy formulation. Chris, it's an absolute pleasure to hear from you. So I'll hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Once again, my name is Chris Chinkota. I'm actually sitting in Lilongwe. That's the Malawi, the home heart of Africa. Greetings to everyone. Yes, as much as I am working for Care, I am actually representing the Leave No One Behind coalition, and I would like to start by taking the same opportunity to thank the Leave No One Behind at global level, as well as the International Civil Society Center for providing us with an opportunity to showcase what we are doing in the Global South. So I will very much share more to do with what we call the Citizen Data Hub. And this is much of a repository or a data bank, which is actually keeping data from grassroots. So we have a number of organizations who form part of this coalition we are calling the Leave No One Behind. And just like in Kenya, we have different engagement mechanisms that are coming from different organizations. And what we are doing with the Citizen Data Hub is to make sure that we are able to collate whatever is actually being generated at local level, and find various mechanisms within our different portfolios to make sure that we're able to channel that to national or even global level. But now what has been the challenge is that we've been using paper-based in the past, and with support from the International Civil Society Center, we were able to do some kind of fact-finding, and this is where we actually thought to be a little more innovative by making sure that we are able to use digital technologies. And in the end, what we are doing is to make sure that all that data which is coming from the grassroots is being shared at national level. Where possible, we are also able to have the representation of some of these impact populations to make sure that they are also able to sit at various decision-making tables so that they can share or advocate for themselves. And in the end, we are also trying to make sure that there are feedback mechanisms as part of social accountability to make sure that whatever is being channeled up should also find its way down through, it could be through conversations between the providers of particular services and the users, and it also could be in form of responsiveness through the action plan that were designed or developed at various levels so that the government is as responsive as possible. We believe that the use of the digital technology will enhance a lot of feedback mechanisms, but also according opportunities for different players be able to be heard instantly, maybe through a click of a button. Moving forward, we are still talking to different partners, especially those that are part of this Citizen Data Hub, just to see if we can be able to release this kind of data beyond the players that we feel are part of this in terms of decision making, so that we can also use it as an open source for others to be able to use. We are also in partnership with the Statistical Office for Malawi, where all data to do with census and other development statistics is sitting, so that we can work together to make sure that this data is even more meaningful. Looking forward to a discussion later on so that we can respond to some of the issues that in the session. Thank you so much. Let me pause there.
Thank you so much, Chris, and great to hear the progress also that you're making in Malawi, in particular on that partnership with the NSO. I think they're so vital to ensure that when official statistics are developed, they're more inclusive. And I'm sure we'll want to dig more into your challenges of moving from paper to digital-based data collection, and maybe thinking a little bit about how you ensured those processes were inclusive as part of the panel session. So thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of my panelists. If I could ask you all to put on your cameras now, we've got questions coming in the chat, and I've got a fantastic list of questions to get us going, but I would like to invite the audience, all of you out there, please do continue to put your questions in the chat as we move through into this kind of more discussion part of the session. So have I got all of my panelists with the with cameras on? And perhaps I can kick it off. I can see that there's already a question about data governance in the chat, and in particular whether the panelists view that as a good entry to ensure that nobody's left behind, and whether we can delve into a few more examples on that. So I think Vinay, this is your sort of specialist interest area on data governance. Perhaps I can come to you first, but give me a little wave if any of the other panelists would like to come in after and just reflect a little bit on data governance. Over to you, Vinay.
Thanks, Claudia. Sorry. I think, yes, obviously data governance is a very good sort of starting point to look at making the digital space a lot more inclusive. I think we also need to understand data governance in a slightly broader context. I think we shouldn't look at it specifically from the lens of, let's say, data protection, which is how data governance is typically looked at around the world right now, at least at, let's say, a legislative level. But I think what is really important for us to understand, especially when you talk about exclusion owing to digital, is the fact that world over, and more so in the global south, we are seeing a lot of digitalization or digitization taking place across sectors. And this extends also to the provision of key government services, including welfare services. And, just as an example, I think, so in India during the pandemic, in their vaccine rollout, what the government did was to set up an app called CoWIN. And so if you wanted to get the vaccine, you had to register and book an appointment initially, of course, either through the app or on the internet. And what this meant was that a huge percentage of the population in India, typically marginalized communities, and by marginalized as well as economically weaker sections as well, who are also typically people who don't have access to the internet or don't have the digital literacy, were excluded from getting the vaccine, which shouldn't be the case. I think there was a lot of backlash to that, and it was only later on that it was opened up to, you could just go in person to any of the public health clinics and register. And I think this pattern of digitization is something that we're seeing across many sectors in India. And it sort of points to this larger trend of what are called digital public infrastructure. And I think it's really interesting that we're having this conversation now with Twitter supposedly all in flames, because communication platforms, or other private communication platforms like WhatsApp and Twitter, have now reached a status of effectively being public infrastructure. They are critical to the functioning of society. We've seen so many movements use these platforms to coalesce. Governments rely on them for service delivery. And so when we speak about data governance and policies around it, it's also really important to look at how governments are looking at regulating these sort of infrastructure, because that's what's going to have a really massive impact on whether somebody or other communities are being included or excluded. And I'll stop there and let the others jump in.
Yeah, really good reflections there. And I've got, this might be a bit of a mean question for the rest of the panelists on global data governance, because you're absolutely right. These kind of core technical infrastructures are now public services. They're where communities and groups quite often convene, and that is a source of agency and power in itself. But then access to those creates an exclusionary barrier, especially if it can be removed because it's not seen as a core service. I wonder if anyone, the rest of the panel, Quincy, you've got your hand up to perhaps reflect on this. Don't feel like you have to answer that specific question, but if you do want to reflect on global data governance, you're welcome to as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to chip in that I think the example of data governance is a very good example of how we over the past couple of years have started to it started a reflection process basically of how to interact, how to organize digital technologies, data within these digital technologies, and our general application of digital technologies in society. And I think it is a very good example because what I'm also referring to what I was saying earlier, what we're trying to do with this feminist tech policy approach is to really start these reflection processes. And I think what Vinay pointed out is that even if the state takes on a governance approach to digital technologies, it is not safeguarded against discriminations either, even if it's not a private corporation or someone else doing it. And I think that's why we just want to sort of emphasize we still also on a governance and government level, we also need these approaches to reflection approaches to look at, okay, what happens if we take a digital technology and what sort of ripple effects, what of negative impacts will it create? And the example in India is, I can very much share that because it also happens here in Germany all the time that the government, for example, at the moment, is trying to roll out a digital ID system, and then only later on in the discourse around it, people start to think about being pushed by civil society that digital ID systems might lead to over-surveillance of marginalized groups that already are over-surveilled in the first place. And so I think we need these very conscious reflection approaches to these things. And data governance is, I think, a very good example of how we start to organize this digital realm in a different way and not leave it up for grabs, basically, but still need even more aspects and reflection sort of on these issues, even from a state level.
Absolutely, there's some really interesting examples there, and especially that distinction between surveillance and trust. And I think that's often a very fine line. I wonder if my colleagues from the legal partnerships in Kenya and Malawi, whether you have any reflections from the ground on sort of these data governance issues. If you don't, I can move to the next question, but I'll just pause there to see if either of you had any reflections. That's fine. I do have an incoming very specific question for you. And I think, Monica, I'm probably going to come to you for this one, if that's okay, because it's about technology, and it's coming in from the audience on how technology and tech policy could benefit persons with disabilities in particular. And I know that this is a focus for you in Kenya. And the kind of reflection from the audience is that across Africa, this challenge is really real. Persons with disabilities are left out in many instances. And in particular, the audience member has highlighted kind of neurotypical, atypical disabilities as a particular issue. And we often hear this from groups of persons with disabilities, that those with physical disabilities may be more represented, even when we're trying to capture information and data and context on that group, and that we need to be cognizant of the disaggregation within that group itself, and not treat these as homogeneous groups. But perhaps, Monica, I can come to you for a few reflections on the tech benefits and perhaps the challenges in relation to persons with disabilities.
Thanks, Gloria. I think the digital technology can really be of great use as a tool for inclusion for persons with disability, because it can help us generate more accurate and efficient data, analyze it better and disseminate and use it better. But on the flip side, we have to, people say inclusion is expensive, and it's true. So there's a lot, well, we keep talking about digital divide. It is true that we need to rethink how we really have the technology and digital platform for persons with disabilities to ensure that they are included. So if we are talking about the visually impaired, how are we adapting technology so that they are able to get the same accurate information that is sitting somewhere on the dashboard that we are trying to talk about? For example, here, how are we ready to put the infrastructure to be able to reach persons with disability? And for that, we have to put money aside and if we are talking about inclusion, are we walking the talk? So that is a challenge that, as much as we take it as tokenism or we help a few people, but how a few persons, people with disability, how do we make sure that we reach more and we enable them to be able to use such technology? Digital technology can save lives if you can use those to, for example, share information or focused on early warnings, for example. And if you are sharing such information and persons with disability specific kind, and you're right, persons with disability, it is not a homogeneous group. There are different kinds of disabilities, different needs. And when talking about digital inclusion, so we need to also think about how do we customize this kind of infrastructure for each category. So I think digital technology can be a really useful tool, and it is, even for persons with disability. The gap is we've not invested enough to be able to enable them to use such platforms. Yes.
Thank you, Monica. So right. Yeah, inclusion is expensive, both in terms of resources, both sort of cash resources, but also time as well. And I think I'm always in the back of my mind is, how do we minimize the burden on communities as we drive to make all of these processes that are so vital and important more inclusive? Perhaps I could come to you though, Chris, with some reflections from your point of view, in particular on inclusive digital development, and how community-driven data and sources like you're developing and using in Malawi could help address the existing digital divide and create more inclusive digital development from your point of view?
Thank you very much. Indeed, this is something that we continue to keep learning. But at most, ultimately, what we've seen to be so impactful is the way we're looking at the different social groups. For example, let's talk about women who are very much left behind when it comes to various issues to do with development. And that is not taking away the digital aspect. As much as we also encounter some challenges, especially on the infrastructure, which has been talked about, you're looking at geographical location and those other challenges that are associated with where network would actually be accessible. But to the most of it, we've seen a lot of changes because women are now getting more involved in terms of using digital technologies. I'll give an example. During the COVID pandemic, we had a number of challenges when it came to restrictions during lockdown. And the only way which CSOs were able to reach out to these, be it in agriculture, be it in health or other sectors, it was through digital connections. Talking about VSL groups, women groups who are in their groups or in different locations were still able to use digital applications to make sure that as much as there was lockdown, they were still able to connect to each other and connect to other players in the field without actually getting together physically. Getting to the digital divide, this is indeed true. The global South is pretty much behind when it comes to the digital technology. But what we can actually do more is, I think I would agree with Monica, where we are looking at investment. And investment is not only talking about the impact populations, we are also looking at even those that are there to provide services. A lot of people have been ditch or digitech phobic. They find it difficult to build confidence to use this. We were just collecting data to do with vaccination levels. This is to do with COVID and polio vaccination levels in Malawi. Gadgets were provided in forms of tablets and phones to government officials so that they can support in making sure that we are able to upload this data to government. Much of the challenges were also to do with the technical know-how. So if we work on this infrastructure and the technical aspect in terms of capacities for people to be able to do this, we are likely to see a lot of changes. And my last point would be where we are now looking at government taking lead on this. It is very good that now the Leave No One Coalition in Malawi is working together with National Planning Commission. And this is where our vision for the country is sitting. We are trying to make sure that they take this and take lead about this. And in the same way, we also realize that we are leaving out the National Statistical Office. And this is also where all the data is. If these are to work, if we are to work to work together with this, we are likely to see a lot of changes in terms of our reach and impact at scale. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. And you've touched on one of what was going to be one of my key questions, which is, do CSOs really need to do this all themselves, or would the panel recommend partnerships as a good approach? And in which case, what kind of partnerships? But perhaps before we delve into that, I've got a little bit of a more general question for all of the panel, which is, what kind of skills, I guess, and capacities and innovations can help the civil society sector to contribute to effectively towards inclusive digital development. So what can we really learn from you in the tech sector in terms of what we're doing in the civil society side, and how can we benefit from using those digital technologies and working with a more data-driven approach? So that's a little bit of a more general question, but perhaps if I can come back to you, Vinay, in terms of how would you propose supporting the civil society in particular to foster that equitable digital development and inclusive approach?
I think, the points that both Monica and Chris raised were really, really very, on the mark, really, because, and, to the question that you raised as well, right? Do CSOs have to do all of this by themselves? And the answer is no. I think it's also really important for all of us to acknowledge just how much CSOs tend to end up doing and taking on their plate. There are just so many roles that CSOs end up playing simply because there isn't that maybe infrastructural support elsewhere. And I think it's really important for us to understand that there is a role for various stakeholders to play, be it the government, be it the private industry, the tech industry, or even, your funders as well, right? I think that all of them have a very crucial role to play. And, just if I could maybe highlight one high level point from each of them, I would say that for the government, at least, I think the biggest thing that they need to do is really speak to CSOs and understand their perspective very critically, because and at least in the global south, I think that governments or other policies don't really reflect the on-ground realities, and that's a massive gap. And so policies that can actually enable CSOs to carry out their work better would really help them. On the private industry side, I think one thing that kind of at least that we have come across in our conversations is that there is a lack of technical ability or capacity for CSOs from time to time, and that what happens is CSOs end up spending a lot of resources, both time and money, in trying to build up these capacities, and it's not always easy. And so I think for companies to try and help CSOs build that capacity would go a long way, and that's where I think partnerships can really help. And this sort of partnership doesn't necessarily need to be just capacity building in terms of teaching someone, but also setting up the systems for organizations. And finally, when we speak about philanthropies, I think, or funders in general, I think the one trend that we've seen, across the board is that by and large, funders try to, fund or prefer funding organizations where they can sort of see results at scale. So especially when you're talking about digital or data, I think there's a preference to fund organizations or initiatives that are collecting larger sets of data or can show that they're working across a large area. And I think there needs to be a bit of a shift in that focus. What's also really important is that in setting their funding agenda, their funding goals, there needs to be a conversation had with organizations on the ground to understand where that funding really is necessary. Because sometimes, even if it's funding for an organization that's working in a very small area on a specific problem, if that's successful, it can be a really good proof of concept for a system that can be scaled across various communities. And I think I'll just end there in saying that I think overall there needs to be better dialogue between all the stakeholders concerned. And importantly, it's not all on CSOs. And I think all of us have a big role to play. I think a lot of what I've said right now is also reflected as strategies in our playbook. And I'm just going to put the link to the playbook in the chat. And so if anyone has any comments to that, please feel free to add them in as well. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for sharing the link to your playbook. We've got people coming in asking for some guidance on this, and I think that would be a really great great way, a great point to start by investigating that link, and also some other reflections from the audience about the point on capacity building. And I think all too often we talk about capacity building as the key to end everything, but it's not about capacity building. It's actually much more important to set up the right systems and processes that allow people to be inclusive. So really vital points there. Quincy, I wonder if I can come to you and see if you have any reflections on how kind of broadly we address this issue, and what CSOs can really learn from you and the approaches that you're taking.
Well, I think I want to connect to quickly also to a point that Rina just mentioned, and that is revolving around the funding landscape, and I can only speak for the sort of for the funding landscape here in sort of Germany/Europe. But what I'm seeing here is also that there is still a certain mindset from funder side to value competition between CSOs in terms of projects, in terms of different things in scaling and these projects. And what we've been able over a long period of negotiations is to have different frameworks set in place for the projects that we do, which enable us to collaborate much more. And it's a point that I would also emphasize a lot, that the collaboration between so-called digital CSOs that here in Germany, for example, it's this term of digital CSOs working in the digital sphere in terms of digital policy or digital technologies and these types of things. And it's a very closed circle in a sense. It is a circle with lots of expertise, but also not with so many ties to other CSOs outside of that circle. And moreover, NGOs working or civil society organizations working in different fields which don't necessarily have a strong tie to digital technologies, but still have to deal with the surrounding topics of digitization and everything happening in society, is also yet too weak. So what we are really strongly trying to do in our work is to work cross-sector in a way and include organizations that, for example, I don't know, work on environmental related topics or immigration topics, and sort of foster the conversation between these different groups, because we all can learn from each other. We need to learn a lot from the others in terms of discriminations happening and all these things, and vice versa. We can share things on digital and dealing with the digital and other things revolving around digital technologies. And one thing that I personally saw in our organization that really helped also to foster this collaboration and exchange was to, especially also with marginalized groups in society, is that we have this concept of fellowship programs where we sort of try to also take away this notion of gatekeeping and things that often happens if an organization is an expert in the field, and then people come to that organization, funders come to that organization, and there's a lot of attention, but there's so many other people out there that usually have also lots of expertise, but not the resources or the connections to the funding landscape, to politics, to anywhere. And through these fellowship programs, what we are trying to do is to disseminate these networks and spread basically to keep these doors open, to make sure that all these people that need to sit at the table and that we need to be working with instead of working for them are also included in the process. And that is now also me speaking obviously from a policy perspective, because we don't do so much tech implementation as such. But that is how we are trying to open up this policy discourse and include marginalized groups and for the moment, mostly in the German society, but we're currently setting up a fellowship program also that's going to be Europe-wide and the Mediterranean. So I think that's one aspect that I can share here that also helps us a lot. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Quincy. Really valuable. And at the risk of getting a little technical, so apologies to our interpreters. I think a lot of what you're reflecting on in terms of the collaboration rather than the competition between civil society organizations is really important. And so the digitization of information allows the interoperability technically, but we've got to talk to each other both at the human and organizational level in order for that interoperability to really be successful and for you to see the benefits on the policy side. So yeah, apologies, that's my technical word of the day, interoperability. I like to get it into every panel, not just technical, but human as well. Monica, I'd like to come to you to just reflect on whether you recognize some of the issues that have been discussed here in terms of behavior around the funding landscape and this competition, and also the building of the digital skills that you require as a CSO on the ground, and whether you experience any challenges there. These skills are highly sought after professional skills at the moment, and so it can be very difficult from my own personal experience holding on to really key digital skills to make organizations thrive. And Monica, I wondered how you in the Leave No One Behind Coalition were identifying some of these key barriers that your coalition faces and what you're doing to address them.
Thank you, Claudia. So yes, LNOB Kenya Coalition mostly the current project works mostly with persons with disabilities and among the marginalized groups. So when you carry out the work, what you get most is that we didn't know this information. We don't have this information, but you try to tell them it's all over the internet. It's on the website. SDGs is something we've been talking about for a while now, since MDGs. They're like, we don't have that information. So, and sometimes when you also get to do research, they tell you these same questions you're asking me. Organization A, B, C, up to D or Z have been asking the same questions. You keep asking us this information, but we don't see what you do with it. So sometimes they express that they feel exploited from the series of researches and information we get from the marginalized groups, but we don't come back to report to them that this information you gave us fed into this larger piece and transformed or led to this bigger success or this change. So if we now have to include digital technology, how do we support to deliver tools, training, and technical support necessary for sustainable, practical application to development challenges, so that we can be able to improve education, healthcare, livelihoods, agricultural production, all those. So apart from just us trying to take or getting more information from these groups, how do we also involve them in all the processes from design, participation, review, all those, so that they don't really feel left behind. And when we talk technology, because we are not slowing down on technology, it's only going to advance more. So if we don't fix the problem now, how much further is the gap going to get before we really talk inclusion? And so what we are really trying to do is to also have conversations with government, because in Kenya, there is certain allocations for funding, for projects, for fund services that are meant to go to persons with disabilities, youth, and women. So we're trying to relink them with the government so that they're able to access this. There's also challenges there. But on the issue, I wanted to comment also on the issue of partnership. We can't do this alone. CSOs can't do this alone with the government. For example, in Kenya, there was the national census in 2019. So they really tried to be intentional in how they collect the data and to include data for persons with disability. They even used the Washington group of questions, but overall, the CSOs, we are like, this number is still too low. We know the number is more. We have our data. This is not the number of persons with disability. Then they will ask, what do you want? We already use Washington group of questions, but then we come back to how did you interpret the data for that tool? But then they've also guided us on how they can accept our citizen-generated data. These are the methods you use to collect. These are the methods you use to analyze. We will score you like this. So there's a lot of good practices we can learn from each other to be able to bring the change. So without data, there's no need. Like, we don't know if they're persons with disability. We don't know their number. We don't know how much they will need for funding for projects or education, all that. So data is really key. And the partnership between CSOs, the government, private sector, the communities is the only way we can push this forward. And given that the ranks are different, some we are at different level of advantages and of influence, how can we really work with the most marginalized and persons with disability to be able to have their voices heard to bring about this change? And lastly, I will say a needed additional capacity will be to really facilitate infrastructure access for individuals and organizations, especially for persons, marginalized groups and their representative organizations. So if we keep talking about technology inclusion, but we really don't go into the root problem of what are we going to do to really get you to have access to internet, to get, how can we reach you when there's a calamity or we need to evacuate you like urgent, flash floods are coming, move. But if you can't access them, they'll be losing lives, property, and all that. So let's create the infrastructure. Let's invest and put money in inclusion and digital transformation for all. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Really powerful points there on tools and training, on partnerships, on feedback. I think there might be something around education in there, but absolutely that vital last point you made on infrastructure. And I do have a question for a range of the panelists on that, about what does access really look like? And so often we just measure access, whereas actually it's quality of access that facilitates inclusion and quality of use. And kind of what are the important sort of quality aspects that we need to ensure are in place to ensure that digital transformation is inclusive. Chris, I want to come to you finally. Feel free to reflect or respond to some of the other panelists, or to answer that question on quality of access, if you'd like. But I give you the floor for a few final.
No, thank you very much. That's indeed a big discussion. We are very much looking at, we've had a lot of debates, even within the coalition, to say, how do we look at our reach? How are we going to be able to validate or quantify that in terms of our quality versus the numbers? This is a huge debate, but what is very important is, first of all, to understand the level of our impact populations, and consequently look at who is in this space working with them, and what are the different capacities in terms of the levels. I would agree with Monica to say that we would have maybe 11 or 15 partners. But when you look at the skill sets, they would obviously be different. And much of our way of working is either driven by the agendas of the donors or the agendas or policies of the prime kind of partners that are actually channeling funds to us. And this is also reminding me of what we discussed earlier in terms of partnership. So during partnerships, it is very important that we understand each other, not only the prime recipient understanding the other recipients. We need to get into a mutual kind of agreement in terms of where are you doing well and where are you not. And this also has to get into a way of analyzing the best practices in terms of how do we use our data. And before we generate that data, what are the best ways or mechanisms that we are using to make sure that the quality of work that we are doing is also being reflected in the tools that we are using to generate this kind of work or data. Coming to where we always kind of are struggling with funds and all that versus capacity building or implementation, we've always asked government to take a proactive role in terms of looking at the landscape and understanding it. Because in most cases, INGOs have been worried, which in some cases it is true, that the capacities of the local players that are there as national CSOs is not that good. And usually they see a lot of risks in terms of providing that. Yes, implementation comes with a cost. And what is also very important is to make sure that you understand the capacities and improve them. But we've always asked them to say that government should facilitate or come as an intermediate player to say, all of you are our partners. How best do we look at the partnership agreements? We are not always talking about pushing funds. Before the smell and color of that cash, we can have formal agreements, and we can start from there, where these other INGOs would start by learning the partnership kind of agreement through just an MOU, which is defining how we can work together as a starting point without actually providing these funds. In such a way, if we are to increase the base, especially working with the locals, you'll find that the localization agenda is also helping to facilitate the reach, because these kind of players are able to work with or without funds on the ground, because that's where they are. So in a nutshell, let me pause there so that others can also come in and comment on the same. Thank you so much, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Chris. And what a fantastic note to end on, that actually, yes, well, funding does need to change. And I was going to refer right back to what I was saying in my call for action at the beginning, which was the need to fund open and responsive systems so that all people can share in the benefits of digitization and data. But actually, Chris, your point there is a fantastic one to conclude on, that actually governments can play a role to start those partnerships, but without the funding, we can put the agreements in place and begin the learning via MOUs and convene and start to learn about each other before that funding is in place. And so that perhaps those calls for funding are actually more inclusive from the beginning. We've had a fantastic session. You touched on so much. I want to thank each and every one of the panelists here for all of your really thoughtful contributions. Partnerships is obviously key. We've got some systems change that we need to work together on. I think there's issues there in terms of ensuring that the feedback systems are in place and that infrastructure is also in place, but as well as tools and trainings. But this idea of partnerships and understanding what skills you don't have, but what skills you need and how you might partner with others is really, really crucial. I'd like to thank our international sign interpreters, our Spanish language interpreters, and our captioner for their work, for following us along in this conversation. I hope that they've made this session more inclusive. And finally, thank you to all of you in the audience. We've got some fantastic questions and discussions and sharing going on in the chat, which is wonderful. And Mariam, perhaps I can hand it over to you to share a few words at the end. We've got lots of calls asking from the audience on how they can join the Leave No One Behind partnership. So I'll hand that over to you, Mariam. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Claudia, and also a huge thanks from me to the entire panel. What an interesting discussion.